me and heartfelt welcome to everybody. First, some remarks on the exhibition Ecologies Working Group. This is already our second meeting. We had the first meeting last year in November in Kassel, also organized by the Documenta Institute, and it is an early stage at the moment, early stage researcher group from Germany and beyond, who are somehow concerned with exhibitions and ecology, so both questions of other ecologies within exhibitions, between exhibitions, but also questions of how to exhibit ecologies in exhibitions, or are there ecologies within, between exhibits. And with this second workshop, our goal is also to consolidate this new research field further, one side conceptually, but also formally. So we are not yet there to say we are consolidated, but these are the goals that we set up right now. And with no further ado, also to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Hannah Baader. This keynote will be held by Hannah Baader, permanent senior research fellow at the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence, Max Planck Institute, where she took the leadership of the research groups Transregional Art Histories, Spaces, Actors, Ecologies in 2012, and has led the research and fellowship program for A-Lab, Art Histories, Archaeologies, Anthropologies, Aesthetics, a collaboration between the KHI and the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz as academic program director since 2019. Her research on maritime iconology, histories of naturalization and culturalization in early modern age, as well as the history of aesthetics, theories of taste and portraits, has led to recent work on trans-regional artistic practices. A collaboration with artist Armin Linke critically inquired the cultural possessions at the Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz in its legal structures, immobile heritage, and historical constitution. Objects held by the Foundation witnessed complex histories of global origins, trade, and dispossession. While some attract thousands of visitors daily, some objects have never left their storage. The project focused on infrastructures, procedures, and practices that constitute the Foundation. She obtained major grants from the Getty Foundation for art, space, mobility, and early ages of globalization, together with Avinoam Shalem and Gerhard Wolf from 2010 to 2015. And the research program Art Histories and Aesthetic Practices, developed by her and Gerhard Wolf at the Forum Transregionale Studien Berlin, was funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research from 2013 to 2019. Thank you. Stage is yours.
This evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to this very promising and interesting workshop. My particular thanks obviously go to Matteo Giacontino and Federica Schäfer for inviting me. I will not give a fully developed speech here or paper, and I will not speak about the project with Armin Linke. It would have been perhaps a good opportunity, but I'm trying to do something else. Let's see where it goes, and thank you for being here. This talk has two parts. One will discuss a contemporary moment, will discuss a constellation of most recent exhibitions, all dealing with ecologies, all held in the winter of 24 and spring 25. And the second part will be historical, looking at historical approaches to exhibiting ecologies and the recontextualizations involved in them. Here in the second part, I will also speak very briefly about another artistic project I'm doing together again with Armin Linke, but that will be only a minor part of it. In my conclusions, I hopefully bring the two parts together and bring all the two lines that are separate into a productive friction. And this will, I hope, allow to get a better sense of current and future problems, the state and the possibilities and the needs of exhibiting ecologies, and maybe also some of the shortcomings. So the question is, would we need a kind of paradigm shift? would we need to think differently and taking up, let's say, what Anna Tsing has proposed to think about a patchy Anthropocene. So how can we introduce these concepts into making exhibition ecologies? So I start with the first part, and we'll look into 4 exhibitions, recent exhibitions on art and ecology that were happening at the same time in Frankfurt am Main in 24-25, and there's 3 people in the room who know these places and spaces very well. So I'm speaking about 4 exhibitions, all opened in winter of 24, and then stayed open, remained open until 25, and they are all in Frankfurt or Bad Homburg, which is close by. And I give you here the 4 exhibitions, and I will speak about all of them one after the other. So just I made this slide to give you an idea, and I hope that in looking at those, we will understand some of the patterns. Before I do so, I would like to thank the curators and the directors in Frankfurt and Bad Homburg, Vera Meyer, Franziska Nori and Ingrid Pfeiffer, and in Florence, Fausto Barbaglio and Francesco Camerota, as well as my collaborators Antje Paul and Tina Flockerts, as well as Devin Göttgemir, who have both all helped me and insisted several times on not leaving out a single of those exhibitions. So the first one is the most obvious one, perhaps. It's Hans Haker, the big retrospective in the Schirn Kunsthalle. But I'm looking here not as a kind of art critique at these exhibitions, but I'm looking rather how they are done, what kind of topics do they propose, in what moment of time are they looking back at an artist like Hans Haker. So an art critic or a visitor interested in art and ecology who was able to spend some time in Frankfurt in December 24 or January 25 could see at last 4 of those exhibitions, all dedicated to questions of ecology, nature and art. The 4 exhibitions were held at structurally and legally different institutions, and that's also for me a very important point, and at least 3 of them were extremely successful within their respective aims and possibilities, and I think that's also important. All featured topics of the 4 exhibitions are somehow connected. They are all dealing with nature or ecology, but in many respects they share as well, and they share in many respects central assumptions, but they show also very different approaches. And this is what I would like also to untackle here. I'm thus looking, as I said, not as an art critic, as if that's a good or a bad exhibition, but I look for certain patterns and specific differences. So even if I will not speak about Venice Biennial or the Commenta or, let's say, critical zones at ZKM or Armin Linke's show on the Anthropocene, I think that in this specific constellation of 4 exhibitions that come together, we can tackle some of the problems that we can see at the very moment. The selection I will discuss here includes 2 major public institutions, that is an art museum on one side and a natural history museum on the other side, as well as 2 private foundations, which is something quite different. And I think we should have looked also into those legal structures in order to understand how they deal with ecologies and what kind of differences are there in those exhibitions. Perhaps before I start, a very quick note on some words, and that's nature and ecologies. Both are highly complicated concepts, as you all know, and what I mean basically is that they mean to look at life forms on this planet. But since authors like Erich Hörn, for example, we know how denaturalized and technologized the concept of ecologies can be since 1945 or even before. Yeah? So the concept of ecology, not necessarily, and you will all know that, doesn't mean at all nature, but it can mean everything else, and it can mean the technosphere. And that leads to some complex, also sometimes misunderstandings, but also interesting points. So the concept of ecology can include, in fact, devastation. And the same ambivalence would be also true for the concept of nature itself. Also, if we speak about nature, we think we know what we mean, but we all know that we don't know what we precisely mean, and if there's one nature or a second nature. So it gets really complicated and troubled, and I think the exhibitions go also into this direction, and as you work most probably also in these realms, this is one of the, let's say, complicated problems. So now back to Hans Hake. Now we have a very classical form of an exhibition, a show on a single male, white, old artist, curated by Ingrid Pfeiffer, and also based in a public institution. Hake, as you know, was born in 1936 in Cologne. He is now the age of 89, and he undoubtedly is a legend of political concept art. Since 1965, the artist lived and worked in New York. The catalogue and curator Ingrid Pfeiffer highlighted the multifacetedness of Hake's work, and therefore argues that despite being perceived as a conceptual artist, Hake operates at, she argues already in the third phrase of the catalogue, also on the field of ecology and natural sciences, land art and institutional critique. The artist himself, and I quote here, describes the world as a super system with countless subsystems, von denen jedes mehr oder weniger durch die anderen beeinflusst wird. So he thinks about the world as a system, and again there we are in the middle of what is ecology. He is, it is stated in the publication, constantly making an exercise in what the catalogue calls political ecology. And here I show Grass Grows, a work from 1996, and that is reinstalled and remade in the space of the gallery here. And here you see the curator of the show, and she's demonstrating how she threw the seeds on the piece of soil that is in, not the gallery space, sorry, the museum space here, when she was doing it before the exhibition opened. And then in the month the exhibition was running, the grass was growing, and one of the people here in the room even discovered a mushroom among the grass, the grass that is growing there. There's a second work that was also here in this gallery space, and that's directed growth, and many of you will know that from 1970 or 72. First elaborated for the Guggenheim Museum in a show where Hake already had put those beans on the ground of the Guggenheim Museum. They already started to grow, but then the show, for political reasons, had been cancelled. And so this project in 1970 was never realized, but was later realized in Krefeld. So what is Hake saying? He's saying that he wants to do something, etwas machen, das Erfahrungen und Erlebnisse hat, das auf seine Umwelt reagiert, sich verändert, was unsolide ist. I like that a lot. Etwas machen, das ohne die Mitwirkung der Umwelt seine Vorstellung nicht geben kann. So something that is not being kind of like a theater show, seine Vorstellung geben, if the environment is not taking part in the process. Etwas machen, das sich auf Licht- und Temperaturveränderungen reagiert. Etwas machen, das der Betrachter in die Hand nimmt, mit dem er spielt und ihm so Leben verleiht. And I think life, as we hear and read here, comes back in the discourses we will encounter again and again. Etwas machen, das in der Zeit lebt, den Betrachter Zeit erleben lassen und dann natürliches artikulieren. Und ich glaube, I don't think I need to translate that, I guess it's evident. And these are quotes that are repeated again and again in his work. Another of his very important works is the large condensation cube from 1963. Here again in a recreation made for the museum show. I think it's interesting to think also about the photographs transmitting those ecological artworks. It's the condensation of water that is inside the tube, and with the temperature around the space, the water is condensating, it's then rising up, and it's retransforming into drops, and the drops then will fall down back again. So it's a kind of circle inside this cube. In reality, some of the water is vanishing as well, and curators use distilled water since several years because they understood if they don't do so, there will be mushrooms also inside the cube. But you see how different it can be to take a photo of such an object. Yeah? Here you see how the magma is presenting the object, and the other photo was taken by the group that traveled to Frankfurt in January. So obviously one of the artworks that is really in dealing with ecological questions involving the people in the exhibition and kind of demonstrating the effects of breath and heat and many people around this cube on an object. And again, I quote, "The conditions are comparable to a living organism which reacts in a flexible manner to its surroundings. The image of condensation cannot be precisely predicted. This is changing freely, bound only by statistical limits. I like this freedom." So he sees also movements of elements of freedom in this work. And obviously you will all know Hans Hake's work, Der Bevölkerung, that is on display at Reichstag, but is here in a Photoshop that he did himself from above on this work where all the members of parliament are invited to bring one bag of soil from the place they belong to and put it here into this area where letters 1 meter high are writing 1 meter 20 centimeters high are writing the name Der Bevölkerung on the ground of the parliament, and he also produced for this exhibition that's not true. He produced a series of photographs of all the species that were growing on the field in the past 2 decades on this area in the Reichstag, and this was on show in Frankfurt as well. So a series of works that are clearly and very precisely ecological, and also this work, Hans Hake, Rheinwasseraufbearbeitungsanlage from 1972, which is one of his very famous works, but also had been heavily criticized because the question is also how far, let's say, this is just an aesthetic move, and how far this is reacting to a specific urgency in a very polluted, in a situation where the Rhine actually in those years was extremely polluted. There is a whole and very interesting debate on this work. And there's a new article that just came out in October that would discuss if there is how the political and the aesthetic are here in a very intelligent way, perhaps, put together in criticizing the institution, but let's say not just aesthetically proposing to look on the pollution of the Rhine in a setting that would separate political action from aesthetics, but really bringing those 2 lines together. And that's very much, I think, the line he's making. There would be also, as you might remember, written documents on the walls of the exhibition place where the amount of dirt and mud and chemicals that are released into the Rhine constantly is also documented in numbers, and there's also specific, of course, German, very well-known companies that are mentioned. Among them is Baader, but also the city of Krefeld itself, where this exhibition took place. The recent article also reconstructs the Nazi past of the site itself, that the place, this house, Haus Lang, constructed by Mies van der Rohe, was a villa that was by somebody who owned one of the companies who would also be involved in polluting the Rhine River in those years. As you might know, only in 1986, the Rhine, then there was an initiative after one of the heaviest incidences of polluting the river by the Sandoz company. Then there was an initiative to start to think about how the Rhine water could be clarified and could be made livable again for those fish. There's also a reading why this goldfish. I don't want to go too much into details here, but I think it's very clear on how many levels Hake is operating and why his works are interesting for our times and why they are used again in this exhibition, this very successful exhibition. I stop here with this show at the Schön, and I come to the next exhibition, The Presence of Absence, and that is a show on matter and traces and the imprints of life in time at the Frankfurter Kunstverein. So we are now in an institution that is not a public institution, it's a private institution that gets some public money, but is not a public institution. It acts very differently and operates very differently with a group of people from the Frankfurt society. And here, this exhibition again is taking up a lot of ecological questions. This is the entrance space where you go into the exhibition. You see a fulgurite, that's a thunderbolt that is kind of hitting sand, and if the thunderbolt is hitting the sand by the heat is going to be crystallized and therefore gets this form. This is an object that comes from a museum, and here that's my longer line of argument. This is an object that comes from a museum of natural history and is transposed into a gallery, museum, Kunstverein space here, and therefore changes obviously completely its meaning. We could ask ourselves how much this object is somehow manipulated in order to make it look like a contemporary or like a, let's say, 20th century painting. But obviously, the curator is interested here in the dynamics of the movement, in the energy, and in the traces, energy, and circulation of energy can leave on matter. And this is the larger line she is also following in this exhibition. Here you see the curator Franziska Nori explaining how she sees, in fact, this exhibition as an exhibition that works on discourses on life, energy, and matter, as I already explained. And this is one of the works that is in show in this exhibition. It's by Toni Toivonen, and it shows the imprint that a decaying body of a dead horse is leaving on a piece of metal. It's enormous, it's mostly as big as the two windows in the back here together, and you see the precise form of this already dead horse that the artist puts on the surface, and he waits until the body is mostly fully decayed, and then he covers it with some protection screen, and you can see that there's probably also a small horse close to the belly, but you can recognize the forms. And so again, it's about an ecological process, and the artwork becomes part of it, but then some process is also stopped. This is a work by the Swiss artist Heidi Bucher. It's called Kleines Glasportal, and this is another central piece in this exhibition. It's a piece of latex that was taken from a psychiatric clinic, the entrance hall of a psychiatric clinic. This was completely covered with latex. The artist always works like this. She's interested in houses, and she takes then this latex away, and you can see the form of this house. This is a very important clinic. It was here at the Sanatorium Bellevue Kreuzlingen, where people like Abby Warburg stayed, so you might know the place actually. And she is interested not only in this space, but in general in houses and the traces that you can see. And I wanted to show this piece because I wanted to remind you that the whole notion of ecology comes from this notion of the house, oikos. So this idea that the house is the center of, is a unity where something enters and something goes out. It is like a living body itself. You bring your waste out, you bring your food in, you cook in the kitchen. So oikos is this thing, and from there, people like Haeckel took the word, and with a lot of very problematic, as we all know, connotations. Last work here is the marshmallow laser fees, distortions in space-time, and that's an installation. I show it because I want to show how technical the approach in this exhibition is also. It's not only grass or something like this, or not poorly grass, as we have seen in the Hans Hake, even though we have also a lot of different works here, but how much, let's say, the technosphere also enters in kind of evoking something like the sky. It's again an interactive work. If you go into this room here, the projection of these moving forms is on all four sides of the room if you enter it, and it will change according to your own movement. So you can see somehow in a time loop how your moving body is affecting the form of those galactic spheres that are circulating around you. Again, as I said, this is an institution that, different from Schirn, has a longer history of interacting with ecological questions while curating. So one of the first shows Franziska Nori did is, for example, Trees of Life, Erzählungen für einen beschädigten Planeten in 2019, Die Intelligenz der Pflanzen in 21, and Bending the Curve, Wissen, Handeln, Fürsorge für Biodiversität. And all those exhibitions she did together with the Senckenberg Gesellschaft. So a research institution, very big one, that is responsible for research in the natural sciences, yeah, and it's a collaboration. I think that's very significant and important to understand, yeah, and therefore this full war she brings into the exhibition, and then she looks, as we have seen, more on single artists here, yeah, and is highlighting their work. Third example is Pilze verflochtene Welten im Museum Sinclair House in Bad Homburg. And this is, again, a private institution. It is run by Stiftung Kunst und Natur, and I will say some words about it later. And in this case, the exhibition is dedicated simply to mushrooms. So where we had traces, energy, matter, in the case of the Kunstverein here, it's very down to earth, honest, let's say, yeah, perhaps in a literal sense, down to earth, even if mushrooms can be everywhere, as we know, on connected and entangled worlds. And I again show you some of the artworks that are on display here, as Anne Karein, a work with mushrooms that is made from textiles, so it's actually not made from any real mushroom. A series of portraits of families, of people in couples, where their heads had been exchanged with these little heads that are all mushrooms and designed by the artist. And you can see, as in the other case, and I think that's also interesting, all the artworks that are in show in this Stiftung Sinclair House are basically from 2020 or 21 or 22, so most recent artworks. This is also true for Selin Balshi. She's herself an artist and biologist. She takes photos, portraits of people she meets, and then she takes some of the particles of those people, some body parts, hair, or what you Schuppen, I don't know the word actually, and then she puts that in a petri schale, and a mushroom is growing over the portraits, and so the single portrait, the individual portrait, comes here together with the mushroom that is growing out of the particles of the person that is depicted here, but is kind of hiding the face, and therefore interacting very strongly on one of those Western inventions of an art form that really has to do a lot with Western artistic practices, and that's the portrait. There's also things like this by Rodrigo Arteaga, and thank you, Devin, for figuring it out. And works like this here from papier-mâché. So somehow it's real mushrooms that are taken here, but again, it's very literal. Everything is quite literal, yeah? It's really the form of the mushroom, or it's real mushrooms that are brought into the show. But then there's also a next step here, and this is thinking about mushroom as a new material within architecture, and trying to unravel how new forms of material could be used in building technologies, and this is here, this My Corks. That's a cooperative by Vera Meyer and Sven Pfeiffer, and they have created a thing they work on since several years, and it's called My Co-Space, and they work with mushroom generated material, and you can even touch it, and it's thought to perhaps be a larger innovation within architecture. So there's a practical dimension to the whole show, and then this show also comes with a lot of guided visits and also experiences for visitors. So again, this institution is very much looking into ecologies, and there have been already a series of exhibitions on other topics, and I think they are somehow also similar. So it's Wälder, or it's sand, or it's Wolken, but also ewiges Eis, or what is nature. So there's circumscribed topics that deal with ecologies, and in a very beautiful and interesting ways invite young, contemporary, most recent artists with works that are produced very often for the exhibitions themselves. It would be interesting also to see that, for example, for the project on Wälder, the institution again worked together with the Senckenberg Gesellschaft. So again, they work together with an institution. Last of the 4 examples is here Nature and Medicine at Senckenberg Museum in Frankfurt. So now we are in a Museum of Naturkunde. This is now a permanent exhibition, and it tries to unravel the relation between nature and medicine in an exhibition that is not a real art exhibition, but somehow plays with this notion of an artsy space in projecting on the ceiling those models of different bacteria or zoonoses. So one is the coronavirus, as most people will immediately recognize. The other is a bacterium of the plague, as well as of malaria. This is the things hanging from the walls. And then there's all kinds of interactive installations. And the aim of this exhibition is to show how much people have interacted with nature in basically mainly using plant-based materials for medical care, but also obviously from animals. It is funded by an institute. Okay, I should say that later on. This is how, for example, some of the questions, the larger questions, the global questions are addressed here in these designs. This is an enormous light screen in the back, and with all the efficient plants that are used in medicine, and have active or effective potentials to cure people. And the whole design and set is taking up the setting of a pharmacy somehow. Yeah? So you open those drawers as if you would be in a pharmacy, and you see things and can pull it out and you get some information. And then it's taking up also things that come from the 19th century, like those glass bowls where things are stored in historical museums. And I think that's also interesting, thinking about those spaces. And then there's a thing we found all very problematic, and that is the section Wrong Medicine. And this is about wrong ways of treating people, in having misbeliefs in the efficiency of treatments. It wants to protect endangered species, so it warns you that you shouldn't use the tiger skin for your care, but nevertheless we found that quite problematic and Eurocentric. And at the end in this exhibition, there's also a panel that would tell you how all the materials used in this exhibition are easy to recycle and can be reused and are not damaging the planet. There is a lot to say on this exhibition because we thought that it's really missing on several points, but I think it's interesting and important to see it as if it is in this institution that is not an art museum, but is in a natural history museum. and nevertheless trying to develop an ecological argument. So again, we see those four exhibitions together, and I hope it has been clear what the differences somehow are, yeah, and how different argumentations are developed in different places. At the same time, there's somehow a shared interest, and also, if you want, so a shared aesthetics. And why is it so? And where are we standing? What should be the next step? Is that the way we could go forward? Or is it a kind of, okay, do we want now to repeat this way of doing exhibitions more and more again? So what is there anything missing? And I think this is the question we have to ask ourselves. So what would be the next step in really exhibiting ecologies, thinking about how ecologies have been exhibited? So I go back now in history, and I try to look from a historical point of view, and then I hope I can bring those two lines of argument, as I said, together. So I look now on historical perspectives on exhibition ecologies, and the main arguments are the Wunderkammer and the natural order of the Enlightenment. As you all will know, or many of you will know, one of the traditional ways to think about exhibiting ecologies is thinking about the Wunderkammer, so the cabinet of curiosity, as it sometimes would also be called. And this is one of the most famous prints that is kind of documenting this practice of bringing all elements from nature together with culture, together with art into one room, and hoping in a productive conversation between those different realms, in showing how, yeah, the creation of the world is complex but is also playful. This had been studied since the 1990s very strongly, and I want to come back to it again at the end. So I think it's a very strong paradigm on how people have looked and thought about exhibitions on ecology. But let me first speak about the Wunderkammer as such, and then try to unpack what it does mean on an epistemological level, perhaps. So I show you one of the traditional objects that people looking into Wunderkammers would study, and these are really marvelous and exceptional. This is a piece for writing, so this is where you leave your pens and perhaps also some paper, but basically ink and your pens. It has the size of 22 to 10 centimeters. It's big like that, you can transport it, and it was kept in such a Wunderkammer, and was, and as you can see, it's decorated with insects, very small beings, and these are natural, they are prints from nature, so they are cast from nature. And it is precisely this kind of heuristic style that seems to be so attractive here. As you can see, it's a mouse, it's lizards, it's bugs, it's how do you call it? Sorry, Muscheln, shells, and other grasshoppers. They are all sitting there, made from silver, as I said, by Wenzel Jamnitzer. So it's really complicated, artful to make such a thing. And at the same time, it enters the writing process. Yeah, so somebody who's writing is using the thing, is kind of connecting to those animals. They are tiny animals, and in the discussion of the time this object had been made in the 1560s and 1570s, people were not so sure about insects. What is their status? And in particular, if they are small, it's not so clear how much they are really living beings. They are for sure not higher living beings. They are not mammals. So somehow it's not so clear, do they have a soul or not? How are they reproducing themselves? So there is a specific fascination precisely with these kinds of animals because they are at the border of what people perceived as understandable life similar to their own. And it's precisely this interest towards the curious and so on that that were at the basis of keeping those objects in the collections or demanding us artists to do such things, to prepare such things. As I said, it's made from silver, so it's even expensive, and it's one of those objects, if you have a visitor, wait, obviously here, this is made for a prince, obviously, in fact for Frederick II, Ferdinand II, in Austria. So you would impress your visitors because you have such a thing. Perhaps even more astonishing for me in looking into what had been historically done in order to expose, show, display ecologies is this object. It's a so-called Schüttelkasten. I think there's no English translation for this thing. It's again this size more or less. It's 12 per 24 centimeters per 17 centimeters, and it shows different small animals. Turtles, snails, worms, something like a dragon. One of the dragons has even wings, so it's not only real animals as in the case before, but it's also invented animals. And there's real snails and real little shells in this box as well. It's made from wood. And yeah. Oh. It can do this. Yeah, and we are 1560. And it's not, I don't know, Augsburger Puppenkiste or whatever, but yeah, that's all it can do. But I think nevertheless this is quite amazing. So you take this Schüttelkasten into your hands and you move it a little bit and the animals will immediately start shaking and moving. And so we understand what the specific interest is here. Again, it's uncanny animals, it's like amphibia somehow, so you don't precisely understand where it stands in the hierarchy of life. And they are, there's, was heißt das? Strahlen, Entschuldigung. Spiral, no, there's another word for it. Spring. So there's little springs here on those animals, and with those springs they move. And the interest here is mechanization. So it's thinking about life. What is life? Why are they moving? But life is transposed in something mechanical. So life is, it's moving here. That means it's somehow living. But living is understood in that moment of time very much as a mechanical device. And this is a larger epistemological argument that has been made for the 16th and 17th century, and Descartes and all those people would have been read in this sense, yeah? So that there is an interest in the invention of clocks and the invention of automata and machines. It all happens in this very moment. What I think is interesting here, you see it in this circumscribed world, you see an environment, yeah? It's those animals, they move, but they move in a kind of landscape or something like that. And that's part of what the play is here, yeah? And at the same time, it's thinking about forces, but mechanical forces. Oh no, I have to stop it. Okay, this is the 16th century. And there's two things. One thing is, there is this moment where in those Kunstkammern, you have those objects and you put it together with ancient sculptures and you put it together with artworks, yeah? And this is how you think you can create something innovative, thinking about the hidden relation between things and how complex God has created the world, yeah, somehow. That's what the Kunstkammer mainly is. And the research on the Kunstkammer is very much an essay by Horst Bredekamp, yeah. It was published in 1993. It became a key to read early modern period, and it became a key to understand also, I think, within art history, how you describe relations to the natural world, yeah? Because everything was related back to the Kunstkammer. The Kunstkammer was understood as the beginning of the museum for good reasons. So there is a very deep, I think, understanding in that, at least among art historians and also curators, that this moment of the Kunstkammer is crucial to understand the relation between nature and art. And somehow this essay had a deep impact, I think, on the field. And perhaps also on exhibition making. And I think we should think through that. What happens next? So now I was in Ambras, where this Schüttelkasten is, so in Austria, at an Austrian court. in the 16th century, and now I move to Florence. This would be another of those traditional places where you had Kunstkammern, such places where there were collections, where people were putting together this botanical, zoological, or natural, let's say, knowledge, ecological knowledge, we could call it like this, and art at the same time. Interested in both, collecting both, and bringing both sides in a kind of friction they seem to have liked in those specific spaces. And then we come to, again, in Florence, we come to a moment in the 18th century where all this comes to an end. And it comes to an end in a very interesting way, also in a very innovative way, also in a very special way. It's one of the first public museums that was ever opened in the West. It's the first public museum for natural history that was opened in Florence in 1775. In a space that is today known as La Specola, but was not called like that at the moment. And I show you here the back side of this museum. And it is a museum where the ruling prince decided to bring all those things out of the Kunstkammer. And the Kunstkammer was not fashionable anymore. It was ridiculous. It became ridiculous, strange, unpleasant somehow to see works of art together with these natural objects. And then they were systematized. But they were systematized and open to the public, and they were explained in a completely new and very interesting way. So, for example, we have this hippopotamus here. It's still existing. It was living for a short time in the 17th century in Florence. It died. It was stuffed then. It was brought to the galleries where also paintings were exhibited and sculptures. And in the 18th century, people started to think it's not nice to have a stuffed hippopotamus together with a chicken. It doesn't work well, yeah? And they separated these things. But they separated, as I said, it in an interesting, systematic approach, and this is due to this Pietro Leopoldo and his museum director, Felice Fontana. And they established this place where on the ground floor there would be all kinds of instruments to analyze nature, physical instruments to make experiments, such as these things here. These are areometry, so you can weigh the weight of air or other gases here, yeah, in those objects. And think of some of Hans Hake's works now, yeah? It's not so far away. Actually, he has a tube that is super similar. And there would be other things here as well. Then they started to collect also minerals, but they started a small botanical collection, and they started to produce those famous wax models that you mostly all know, but I think it's important to see them in a larger context here. This is now the project I'm doing with Armin Linke and my colleague Costanza Carafa in Florence. So we go through to these places, we do photographs, but I present you just a small selection of this material here. Now the interest is really on unsecting the human body and all its parts, reading into the interior, and trying to understand what is inside, and again thinking about what is life, yeah, and how you can describe life. So this is the famous female body of the Venus. This is wax models made of the brain of brains, human brains here, in a comparative line, yeah. And you can all see different forms of brains. This is a body, I mean, it's not a body, it's a wax head of a male figure, and now you see how it is at the specific moment in a museum space while the museum had been renovated. But you understand how that now there's this view into the interior. It's not only the human body, but it's all the living world that is on display in this museum. The museum has 30 rooms, so it's enormous, and it has all kinds of birds, it has all kinds of mammals, and they are all collected, not in this way, because that's 19th century, but somehow similar. And today, as you might imagine, there's a lot of species that are already dead and lost, not dead, and extinct. in those vitrines as well. So in a way, this collection has a new and different value as well. But let us stay at the moment in this 18th century moment, where we see how in a single museum there's everything of the living world in a very precise order. So wax models made for plants. There's several hundreds here. And I could show you more and more and more. I won't, don't worry. And there's things like this, for example, a collection of fungi. It's 60 or 70 different fungi that are kept, again, prepared in wood with their names. And all this kept in the museum. Think of the exhibition I just introduced at the Sinclair House and how similar some of the contemporary artworks actually look to those objects. So it's very interesting because we have the files of this museum. We don't really know how it looked like, but we can reconstruct somehow what they did at the museum. You know, it was open for 2 hours, 4 hours a week, but everybody could go in. So it was for general public and not only for educated people, not only for nobility. It was a kind of attempt to educate the population in Florence and Tuscany. And there were all kinds of experiments done. And we have documents of visitors who would say they do all kinds of experiments and they don't write it down because they fear otherwise the church will punish them. But they do it here because they are cutting, for example, they do look into anabiosis. So they look into animals where if you cut them, 2 parts live. Yeah. And so they are thinking about the soul. If you cut an animal and they have 2, so is there 1 soul or 2 souls? So it's putting also, let's say, the religious system in crisis, but there's more of those experiments that were done and also the visitors that saw that place. So you have to imagine the 3 stories of the space as giving you a whole demonstration of how the world looks like in dead form. Everything is dead. Yeah? The birds are dead, the animals are dead, there's stones, there's nothing living here, and at the same time the whole discourse is on creating something that is life. Yeah? And if it's God or not God that gives this life. I finish here a little bit, and that's basically already the end also of my talk, and it should be also, I think, the end. I think it would be really interesting to think of those structural implications of a spatial setting where you walk through nature. Yeah? And here I quote Wolf Leppenis, das Ende der Naturgeschichte. This is a very interesting book by an author who had tried to understand how this idea that nature is something that was made by God, had a history of 6,000 years, and was not changing without evolution, how this idea came to an end in the 18th century. Yeah, with museum spaces like this one. Even Darwin is still 100 years far away from this moment, yeah? But still already people started to think about that it's impossible that all this was done by God in one single moment, the creation. So there's a very critical move in all this here. And at the same time, it comes with a kind of sequence in rooms. And this sequence in rooms is still so important in our museum settings today. And how much spatial orientation in creating spaces where we understand ecological processes is, I think, again, still an issue. Okay, so I think what we need somehow is that we go beyond this Wunderkammer paradigm. And I would say that there have been a whole bunch of exhibitions in the 2000s, among them one very important one that happened in Berlin in the year 1999-2000 in Gropiusbau, called Sieben Hügel. At the time it cost 28 million euros, that showing Deutsche Mark. This was enormous, yeah? And it tried to bring together, let's say, technical innovation with all the knowledge of the world. And if you want, so it was a predecessor of Humboldt Forum, I think. It has an exhibition catalog of 7 volumes and was an enormous enterprise. And somehow it's built around this notion of the Wunderkammer. So when you put everything together and then there's creative chaos, I understand that this is beautiful, and from there there's something new coming out of it. But I think for the ecological moment we live in, this is at all it's not working at all. Yeah. But if you look back, I think some elements in the exhibitions I tried to introduce to you in my first part, somehow they build still on this Wunderkammer principle in mixing, bringing objects from the Natural History Museum to exhibition space. And I'm not against it. I'm just saying that we should be very careful if we do that, yeah? And we should very much understand what kind is the operation we are doing here, yeah? And how we are using one paradigm together with another paradigm, and that is the paradigm of the 18th and 19th century, and trying to develop something where I think in thinking about ecology today and the needs of today, I think it's not any longer working. And as I said, I think still it's very strong. So I want to conclude perhaps all this here with some people of you, 10 people might have seen, with an exhibition that was done in Zurich at the end of last year again and the beginning of this year, and it's AAI, Experiments in KI, Kunst and Architecture. And somehow it's the end of a long time of Daniel Baumann, who was a curator and director of this institution, and that's his final exhibition. And I think it's quite interesting what he did in his final exhibition. So he decided not to show anything, basically, but to do something. And he invited this collective of architects that are thinking about sustainable architecture and circular architecture, and they created this space within the exhibition rooms, and that's basically a place where people can sit and speak. And then there's this whole series of lectures and events, and there's also classes in what they call sub-curating. So it's not about curating, but it's about sub-curating, so giving classes for all kinds of people how you curate, so kind of democratization of curatorship. And this is what they did in this exhibition. Seems again that it was an extremely strong success, but Megali, perhaps you know more about how it went. So I think it's a quite interesting proposal in thinking about new forms of using the space of the museum, kind of doing new activities in the museum, not as a line that can be followed for a very long time. And I'm not saying this is the only way, but I think thinking about this break in order to rethink the museum spaces and what they do, and then perhaps start, without those paradigms, particularly of the Wunderkammer, in your mind, to rewrite the complex relation between human and other life forms, but not only life forms, but all ways of being on Earth. I think that is very much needed, but it needs to be so specific from my point of view. And therefore, I like this idea of the patching here, this idea that you take something very close and you look very carefully at a specific situation, and going into museum spaces and very critically looking on what is there and how what their history is bringing. I think that could be one of the ways out. I'm not saying that those exhibitions I introduced are failing, not at all. I think they are all beautiful exhibitions, mainly, and important, and I like them a lot. I'm saying what could be the next step and what could be a way to rethink some of the paradigms we are interacting with the natural world. And I think I should stop here. I could say, of course, again, that one could think of the curatorial as this way of taking care and reorganizing, giving sense to materials. And again, that is part of, I think, ecological curating. And now I'm really sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the keynote. I will begin now with a small Q&A, and I think the first thing I would ask, just following the Kunsthalle Zürich, where I actually used to work at. And there was another exhibition that I quite liked. It's been a while. It was titled Scalable Skeletal Escalator, where they chose to forfeit any authorship. There was one artist who was invited, and a choreographer, and then she invited other colleagues, partners, to collaborate, and then the whole exhibition was incredibly, not interactive, but reactive in a sense. There was a score where performers would interact either with visitors, depending on how they would behave, but also with the staff at the institution, and the weather and everything, and there was also sound elements, etc. And now I didn't get to see the AAA show, but I was thinking a lot about paradigms that they share, and or not, or both did, which both excludes, and one was this idea of authorship, of like giving it away or not working under that, thinking that like Wunderkammer, also the other four exhibitions still work under this idea of Hans Hacke. It's all related to Hans Hacke. The Pilze, like it's always mushrooms. There's always this connection. Same with the Natural History Museum or museums, where every discovery is also related to a scientist or to someone, and it's always brought back to one single individual. And something like this too, the example I just mentioned, but also this exhibition where it's just given away, and instead it's more of a emergence in a sense. Would this be maybe something you'd agree with?
Absolutely. I mean, I haven't seen that as well, and there's no way to see it. I guess. But yes, absolutely. I think that's most probably one of the possible ways to go for the moment, and to work. And I think that's an interesting proposal. I know that it's also, let's say, giving away authorship. Yes, that's a possibility. Perhaps sometimes you can even be easy with authorship. I wouldn't say, oh, that's all bad. That's perhaps again a shortcoming, but letting it go, I think that's something that can be productive. At the same time, okay, you need somebody making decisions. You need somebody taking something into his or their hands. So it will be difficult just to let go. However, and I think they are kind of proposing here in making this stage. So there are some tasks. They gave some tasks, not so many. So some people like Philipp Ursprung probably would say, okay, you need those tasks. You set yourself a task, and that is the frame you act in. And somehow this stage is also giving a kind of task to the people at the Kunsthalle and the people joining in. Perhaps that's one possible way to break some of the narratives that are still so inherent in the museum spaces.
Maybe like implicitly there's also the question or the hypothesis that something like exhibition ecologies or generally exhibition studies are not just for the sake of knowing more about the exhibition, but also about advising exhibition makers?
Oh, I don't know. No, I'm not an exhibition maker. But yeah. Well, for me it's difficult because I think there's so much knowledge in what those people, the curators, they bring in so much knowledge, and we shouldn't minimize what they bring in. We should acknowledge that most probably, and that's them. So, and as I said, I think there's a lot of very interesting work done in the 4 exhibitions I tried to show here, and in many others. The question is, what would the institutions allow? That's one large question. Obviously, not every institution would allow certain things, and the Hacker work is very much around this question of what an institution is really allowing, what are the limits, and why are there limits. There might be sometimes also good reasons, but developing creative ways of working with these materials, I think more is perhaps not. I can't say more, I guess.
Thank you so much for this talk and this insight. And maybe my question comes out of ignorance because I'm not an expert in modern art, but I really like this comparison, or like this view onto the Wunderkammer and later onto these exhibitions. And I was just wondering, because the Wunderkammer is about possession and keeping things, and what is going to happen with all this stuff in these 2024 exhibitions? Is it going to be stored somewhere, or are the mushrooms growing somewhere else? And why not just go outside and watch the grass grow outside? But so the question is actually, is it going to be stored somewhere, and then where is it going to be placed?
Yeah, I think that's a very important, very valid question. So yes, and the larger question in the debate on ecology is why the museum at all, obviously. Yeah, do we need it? Does it make really sense? Does it have an educational question? The educational impact. So these things, so the Sinclair Foundation, they don't have a permanent collection, and you might correct me if you know more, Tina, here, but so that was what they told us, so they don't have a permanent collection. So these artworks will go somewhere else. Of course, we didn't speak about the art market, that's another element in this story. But they will most probably go back to the artists, I suppose. The Sinclair Stiftung has a second venue, and that's a large territory in Bavaria, where there's just natural environment, and they do things there. Yeah? It's a very huge foundation, I think, with a large endowment, and they do these things also at the Sinclair House. So there is a lot of interaction also going into the environment, doing these kind of things, working with kids. So there's a lot of educational work as far as I understand. So yes, what they do with the mushrooms, I don't know. I mean, those were not real mushrooms. Yeah, there were also artifacts somehow. Those I showed here. Apart from those in the Petri Schalen, and those, I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But I think I can connect kind of well, because I was also just thinking, you mentioned earlier that the ecological discourse or theoretical discourse also can be also very technical, and then in the Wunderkammer it was like all these dead objects imitating nature basically, and now here with this proposition, it's also, I was just asking myself, like, where is the living here, right? Like in Zurich in the last one, like this is also more maybe creating spaces for discourses and not really to connecting to natural material or like living material. So I would also, I'm thinking a lot about like porosity of institutional walls basically and like in these exchanges of between like inside and outside.
Yeah, of course.
Just
I mean, this is all done from reused material. It's done with students, and it can be reused afterwards. So there is on the stage, there's a lot of thinking about this place. Obviously, it lives from the persons coming, yeah, and on the things happening there. That's the main assumption. And yes, it's trying to transform the museum in something else. And I'm not saying the museum is obsolete, I wouldn't say that at all, yeah. Of course it has this logic of keeping, yeah, and keeping at all costs. And we know from many cultures that there's no wish to keep things, yeah, and no need to keep things. But that's basically in the museum, that's in its DNR, in its gene code, and that will be hard to unpack. And it has also in its gene code is looking somehow, yeah. But there is, and I hope I showed that there is obviously a problem in looking, yeah. And I think the whole thing is about gazes and how we look at things. And that is, I think, the thing where we should kind of find ways of turning things around in a way that we start looking differently at things. But it must come, and therefore for me it was important to look at this natural history museum. I guess if we don't take all this information seriously and we really start working tough on also complicated scientific methods, it's lost, yeah, because you can't be ecological, I think, just on the surface. You need to go, and therefore the technosphere is important because you can't avoid it. And on these screens, they were speaking about AI, on these stages, about AI. So you can't avoid those discourses, you have to go into them, yeah? And it's not just about mushrooms, yeah? That would be kitschy, I guess, yeah? And that's the danger. But that comes with a lot of work, I would say.
Thank you so much also for the insight into your current work at the Natural History Museum in Florence, and for planting the seed about thinking about the next step. And because you just said looking, the problem of looking, and the connection of works from natural history collections going into contemporary art exhibitions, I was just thinking actually about two exhibitions also taking place in Switzerland, I don't know, somehow. And one that I just recently saw is Naming Nature at the Natural History Museum in Lausanne. Not Neuchâtel. And it was really different from everything I've seen before in any natural history museum. So what they did is they reconfigured their whole collection, or part of the collection, under the perspective of a decolonial kind of measurement. So what they actually did is close down the glass cases, and so you actually had to kind of open a curtain to be looking at the taxidermy. They took out animals that are extinct, and they also disclosed all the information where the mostly animals have been taken, and also really made clear that you're basically looking at a dead living being. So they really reconfigured everything, and what they also did, so maybe that is really something that is, I think, worth looking into, like this kind of strategy. And what they also did, they implemented contemporary artistic practices that were working with the exhibition and with some of the part of the collection. And so there was kind of the counter movement to what you were presenting of like artists kind of making use of those natural history objects, and but artists now being invited to kind of not only comment, but like work with it. So I thought that was really interesting. And a second example that I'm thinking about is the Bern Kunsthalle, because the new curator is trying, I think, using the idea or the notion of like a permi-circular museum. Like I wasn't able to enter because basically it's closed down because it's kind of rethought and reconceived in terms of turning the whole thing itself into an ecosystem. So I haven't really looked into it so far, but just from the examples that you were giving, I thought that might be something that kind of frames or kind of provides notions for the second step.
Yeah, perhaps I have a little bit exaggerated also with the second step, obviously. But yes, I think it's really crucial to think through the natural history museums and the art museums that have been somehow also been done. It's not that this is all completely new, but I think we have to do it again. That's important. And yes, so I found it interesting that the Stiftung Sinclair House, they say we ask scientists for interventions. Yeah. So the same strategy we want for the artists doing in the natural history museums, because the natural history museums are so problematic. They ask for artistic interventions, but obviously also the art museum asks for interventions of the scientists. And this is why I was so interested in here in this kind of collaboration between those institutions and the Senckenberg-Gesellschaft. Yeah. And the same is happening also here in Berlin with the Museum for Naturkunde, obviously, yeah, where the artistic intervention should save everything. Yeah. But yes, and as I said, I really like all those attempts. I have more problems with the medicine with the exhibition on medicine. I think that was not really not well done. But for the rest, I would say it's all super valid. I'm not criticizing it, but wondering what could come. And yes, thank you for bringing in more examples.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it would be very interesting. I think you mentioned it before, but could you maybe point out a little bit more? I mean, these exhibitions are quite different from each other, and maybe it's also partly not comparable or something. But you were pointing out that maybe like institutional politics or the way how they do exhibitions, what they show, how they show it and present it is kind of different, maybe also because the exhibitions are like public or private, or or have different constellations. Maybe you could point out some of these aspects you figured out that makes maybe a difference you think comes from this side.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm still thinking through it, but I think the main difference, for example, so what I see here, for example, at the Stiftung Sinclair House, it's contemporary, rather young artists, and they really work very much on, as I said, or materially or literally very close to the topic. So the topic is dominant. The single artworks are okay, but from my point of view, not always wow. Yeah? They work. It works super well together in a sequence for the exhibition. It's very educational, and I think that's the main aim of this foundation. It's very educational, and that works very well. Yeah? It transmits something about So of course, this exhibition works on that everybody has read Anat Singh and everybody has read Martin Sheldrake, so people know a lot about mushrooms at the moment, or they have heard about mushrooms, they're interested in these things. But it's taking up this discourse, and then it's going into a very educational, very clear sequence of possible approaches, yeah? And inviting people really to think creatively what mushrooms are, but not too complicated, and not the artistic positions, I would say, are not, yeah, I'm a little bit feel uncanny, but not too complicated artistic positions, I would say, yeah. And that's completely different at the Kunstverein. These are much more complicated, also more problematic somehow, perhaps, but they are more complicated artistic positions. And that's the aim of the Kunstverein, I would say, because the Kunstverein works in that sense, I would say, most probably with artists that have already a name. So I think there's a big difference. A big difference is also financial possibilities. Stiftung Sinclair House, everything is perfect. Yeah, it's really perfect. It's beautiful. The guidebook is beautiful. The quotations are well done. It's advertised well, so you can see there is obviously a foundation that is engaging with a lot of money. And this is not so much true for the Kunstverein, a little bit, and it will be different for many public institutions, I guess. Yeah. So I think there's also this balance. Sinclair House is a rather recent institution. So they started working, so you have to see where they go. That's also part of, so for now they have this program, but what will come next, you don't know yet. Whereas Frankfurter Kunstverein is a very established but private institution. And I think there's a big difference. And obviously the museum in the Schirm is obviously a museum that needs to do single shows of living artists somehow. Yeah, for them it would be probably much more difficult to just come with a topic. They also do that, but so there is different politics behind it. And the same would be true for this exhibition at the Senckenberg Museum, because in reality that's also paid by a foundation, and it's paid by a foundation that comes from a pharmaceutical company. Yeah, so there is a quite direct relation, and that's Fresenius, and Fresenius is one of the really large producers in the pharmaceutical industry. The donation is older, but so I mean there's a very specific also interest, yeah, in why you do this kind of public engaged work. And I think we should have to take note of that. It changes something. Is that a kind of answer?
Mm-hmm.
Now, due to some growing metabolic needs, I would limit that to the two last questions. Ines and Leonie, you had questions?
I was just wanted to thank you for your interesting talk, and I was thinking about your presentation. You talked about the paradigm of Wunderkammer encyclopedics, and to think of these narrative models or the spatial organization, you then showed the artworks. And I wondered if you could relate some of the isolated artworks you showed with like a curatorial statement, or there seemed something, because it seemed like that the narrative model or the paradigm was almost contained within the proper artwork, that it did you see like redundancy or
You mean for the Schüttelkasten?
no,
Or
in the presentation,
Yeah.
basically we saw the artworks. I imagine that Hans Hacker, I haven't seen it, but that it was more of a biographical model.
yeah.
But if you when you think about Wunderkammer and encyclopedia, this organization of the Wunderkammer, how did they relate to the edition of the artworks, for example?
Yeah, I think in the
Because we saw basically artworks and not exactly the edition of the artworks in your talk.
The edition in the sense of
Of curatorship,
Like the
Yeah.
layout or?
the arguments.
of this, but of the Hake exhibition.
No, the
Of,
Hackers is easy, but of the other ones. But I imagine that the mushrooms was sort of an accumulation.
it's an accumulation. Yeah, it is an
Like
accumulation.
Wunderkammer.
It's not making. There's one
distance.
argument, and that's the last room, and this architecture. So it's making the argument somehow, and you could criticize it if you want. Is okay. You go through these artworks, but at the end you think about utility. Yeah, again. You think about a new material, and it's an ecological material, but that is the last room of the exhibition, yeah. And somehow I showed you kind of the sequence you follow, and it would be, of course, many more objects. Yes, you're absolutely right, and it's crucial, yeah. What is the curatorial, and that is in that sense there is therefore. Yeah, that would be also my critique perhaps of the Sinclair House. Yeah. It's adding one thing to the other. It's not a larger curatorial argument. Whereas at the Kunstverein, I think there is a very strong curatorial argument, very complicated. Yeah, very strong. Sometimes working, sometimes not working. It would be very interesting to go through the different stories. It's again a 3-story building, and it has a very elaborate way of putting specific works in specific settings. So yeah, there I think is a strong curatorial impulse that you can. That would be, but therefore I said I'm not speaking as an art critic here. Yeah, I'm looking into models of speaking about the environment. Is that a kind of answer?
I think that's a wrap. Again, Baader, so much for the keynote, for the answers, for the conversation. Thank you all for coming and joining the conversation. I hope we see many of you tomorrow evening at Künstlerhaus Bethanien for the next keynote by Shane Jackson in Berkeley. And have a good night.